like I said, I am known to go way over in these types of calls. And so I'm going to try to pack everything into this hour. And so I may breeze through things. I also, knowing myself, tend to talk very, very quickly, but this will be recorded. And if you have any follow-up questions, feel free to reach out to me and I'll give you some links there at the end. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen and we'll jump right in. Okay. All right, so hopefully you guys can see my screen. I am going to share these slides. Or actually, yes, I will share the link to these slides as well, just in case anyone wants to follow along. But then I will also make them full screen. All right, so these should be in the chat. If anyone wants to access them, I will send out a link after with the recording as well. And let's get started. So welcome to week 1. Hopefully this alone of the Doing Content Right review sessions. So most of you, I believe, are new to Doing Content Right. Some of you may have already read the book. You may have even gone through the live sessions that we did around a year ago. These review sessions are not meant to go through everything in the book. That would be impossible, but they are meant to be interactive in the sense that I would love for, by the end of this session, you to have made progress on your content property, whether that's a blog, a newsletter, a podcast, etc. And I will say that everything in Doing Content Right should be applicable across those different types of content mediums. So it's not just for a newsletter, it's not just for a blog, for example. Okay, so today we're going to go through several exercises. We're going through chapters 1 and 2. And again, we can't go through everything there. So I still recommend that you go through the book, and in the resource directory that I'll call out in a second, I'll actually go straight forward to that. It's at bit.ly/DCR-resources. That is a resource directory that you have access to at any time. And like I said, we previously did live sessions. The format for those live sessions was much more me speaking at people and going through the content. And so if that's what you want, you can go to the resource directory and watch those videos at another time. There's also other things there. But as I said, today we're going through chapters 1 and 2, which are your personal monopoly in building your home. There are 10 exercises in the exercise booklet that comes with Doing Content Right that you can go through for these 2 chapters in particular. And you can see we're really going through this top section. So this is kind of like an infographic that goes over the whole scope of the book. And this top section is really, talking about how competitive content is today and how you find your differentiator within that very, very competitive space. Okay, so I talked about the resource directory already. This is just a call out for if you want to actually pull up the exercises. There will be images on these slides, but if you want to go and pull up these exercises or print them out at another time, you can go to gumroad.com/library. That should bring you to your Gumroad library where you should see Doing Content Right. And you should see several different files there. And the key file that you're going to want to potentially pull up for this session is number 7, I believe. I might get that wrong because I'm almost switching them, but it should say exercises. And there's a PDF version and there's an EPUB version, but that's what you might want to pull up. But again, if you don't have that, that's fine. And also, if you have not gone through anything from Doing Content Right so far, that's okay. Okay, let's jump in. So before we start going through, the format of this is going to be a little bit of information with exercises slotted in, and hopefully it should flow together, but I will say this is the first time that I've done this particular format for this session, so bear with me. Okay, so as I said, I'm gonna breeze through some of these slides. Some of them before were more formatted to a long form exercise of me talking, but basically what I want you to get away from this beginning part is that we're in 2021, we're soon to be in 2022, and it's been decades or the internet has been around for decades, but only until recently did we see this influx of just, excuse my language, but a shit ton of content, just so much content online. And so you can kind of see the history of the internet, and it took several decades before even the first full-time blogger emerged, right? That's 1994. The internet early iterations were in the 60s. And then if we flash forward, it wasn't until 2013-ish when we started to see this big influx of many of the tools that we're familiar with today, right? That's not so long ago. That's less than a decade ago. And in this past decade, so much content has been produced. So in 2016, the number of WordPress websites 5x in 5 years, and that continues to just grow exponentially. Here's another crazy stat. 300 plus million domains were registered in Q1. I believe this was of 2020. But that just shows the sheer number of people trying to participate in what you might call this information economy. Okay, so we're gonna have a couple chat questions interspersed in addition to these exercises. So the first one, and again, this data point might be a little old, like 2019, 2020-ish, but the question is, how many tweets do you think are sent per minute? And feel free to just drop your guess in the chat. And as I wait for some of those answers, I'm just reading your question, Martin. So a link to the ebook, if you haven't received it, email me at hello@stephsmith.io. I'll check that email right after this call and I'll make sure you get your copy. It's possible that you have, you got an email originally if you had any sort of receipt and it had a link that said access the content. Sometimes if you didn't have a Gumroad account set up already, that can cause issues. So you need to just register a Gumroad account under that email. And again, if you email me, then yeah, I should be able to help you out. Okay, so I'm seeing a ton of different guesses. Some people are guessing in the millions, many people in the thousands. And again, this is per minute, right? So the answer to this one is 350,000 tweets are sent per minute. And here are some other stats related to, again, all types of content. So remember, when we talk about content, you may have a preference, but the idea is that every single kind of content medium is being saturated today, right? And that's growing over time. So thousands of WordPress posts are created per minute, hundreds of YouTube hours, millions of Google searches. All of this is happening, like just since I asked that question, all of this has happened on the internet. So what I'm trying to get across here is this idea that information is, you could say, this is a quote from the book, the new oil, in that you can create it, you can refine it, you can trade it. But we really are in this attention economy that everyone is jumping to participate in because it can be extremely lucrative, whether that's through money or that's through gaining attention through people, following your work. So there's a couple things that I want you to take away before we jump into the first exercise, which is that because so many people want to participate, the mechanisms within this industry have changed. There's 4 things I'm going to go over, and I'm just going to jump right into them. So the first one is that supply and demand have not grown symmetrically. What does this mean? It just means that the reason so many people are participating is not because people woke up one day and decided, wow, I want to participate in this information economy. Instead, what happened is they said, wow, it's so easy to participate in this information economy. The tools that exist today have made it so easy for all of us listening to this to be on this call, but similarly to publish online, right? And because of that, you see this massive influx of supply, but people have always wanted great content, right? So the demand has not matched that change. And so one of the key takeaways here is just for you to know, we are in a much more competitive space, but also just the supply, the competition, trying to participate for that demand has changed exponentially. So that ratio, that balance is not the same as what it used to be. Okay, you may have also heard of the diffusion of innovation curve, where really in any space you want to, or you benefit from being early, right? And so you want to be an innovator if possible, but even, you want to get in before the late majority. And one thing to keep in mind here is that as you try to participate in this very competitive space, a lot of people jump to think, I need to create something completely new. And that's fine, it can work, but also you can create something that already exists, but just be better at it. And I'm gonna get to what this means a little more clearly, but that is actually what most people could benefit from, is not trying to reinvent the wheel, but trying to figure out how that wheel can be done more effectively. So that brings me to this idea of saturation. And again, I'm just breezing through this. You can watch the other videos where I talk about this in more depth. But again, this idea where a lot of people think saturation in a space is the sheer number of people in that space, but it's not. It's the likelihood that you can out-innovate what already exists. And of course, the more volume in a space, the higher likelihood that there are great participants, but not always. And so when you look at a space, a lot of people shy away from something where they see a lot of people participating. But instead, sometimes there's this quote from Paul Graham, which basically gets this idea that sometimes if people aren't participating in a space, it actually means that, well, no one cares about that space. And so just keep that in mind as you're thinking about what you're actually tackling with your content, because again, some people kind of jump to or gravitate towards thinking that they need to find something where no one's participating. And if you imagine these circles as industries, right, and this applies to startups as well, not just content, you actually likely want to be in a space where, you know, there's a lot of people participating, but if you imagine none of them are really doing a great job for the customers or for the readers, those are amazing opportunities. And Costco and Stripe kind of entered those industries where general retail and fintech in particular, they saw a gap. It wasn't uncompetitive, but they saw a way for them to be more competitive than what existed out there. The third thing is that there are new distribution possibilities. And I promise this will all kind of wrap together in a second, but basically in the past, if you think even 30 years ago, your ability to reach people was only through mass media, right? So the radio, a newspaper in your city. Today, that's not true, right? There's tiny niche subreddits where you can reach people. You can run ads on Facebook that reach very, very targeted individuals with very, very targeted criteria. And you can kind of go down the list of all the different ways that we can reach very, very niche communities today, which was not the case in the past. And that's important because if your distribution potential in the past was just through mass media, that also meant the appetite, or rather the topics that you could talk about were mass media as well, right? So a large newspaper in New York would not take your article about, you know, some tiny niche thing that only, 2,000 people in New York care about. But in the age of the internet, there may be 2 million people that care about that globally around the world that you can now reach. So remember that the things that you can talk about have changed by the nature of the distribution that exists. And then finally, attention is not returned linearly. If we understand that now the internet is this equalizer in that we can reach everyone in the world potentially, then you also must flip that on its head and say that everyone participating has access to that same thing. And therefore, if everyone participating has access to that same thing, then only the very best wins, right? So before, if you had kind of good content in a place, let's say I grew up in Toronto, maybe I could actually reach a decent amount of people with the Toronto newspaper because I'm only competing with other writers in Toronto. Well, today that's not true. Today I'm competing against every single person on the internet. And if I'm not a great writer, well, then my good writing probably won't get very much attention, and it's not linear returns, right? So the quality of the content, and quality does not always mean long form. That's a really important caveat for me to make. So the best quality content will reach a disproportionate amount. And this is not just with content, but anything where there's this democratizing force tends to see this kind of curve, this exponential return for a small group of people who provide the most value. So now that I'm done going through the fundamentals, and I promise that will be the longest section where I talk at you without going through an exercise, is just this idea that I really wanted to nail down, which is that the internet, and specifically the tools that have been created in the last, let's say, couple decades, have made it so much easier to create content and to distribute it in a way that's accessible to anyone with an internet connection. But that by nature has made it much more competitive. And we all know this, but it's really important to really ingrain this in yourself if you are going to participate in this thing. Now, it does not mean there's not opportunity. That's, I think, a fallacy where people think, okay, well, if it's much more competitive, then therefore I can't compete. That is not true. There are newly minted, TikTokers, bloggers, podcasters every day that are extremely successful. So that doesn't mean that you can't be as well. But it's important to understand the industry or the space that you are participating in, right? To understand these dynamics, because without that, you're kind of just venturing in blind. All right, so the next question, and I want to use this as an example that leads into the exercise, is what word, and you might think this kind of comes out of left field, but it'll come together. What word comes to mind when you think of Costco? And then kind of additionally, what word comes to mind when you think of Target? And if you're not from America, I'm actually from Canada, so but we have Costco there, and I know it's kind of a global brand, Target less so. But if you don't know, if you're not as familiar with the brands, feel free to skip this. But I'm seeing Costco, I'm seeing cheap, prices, value, bulk, smart, Target, not Walmart, Costco, wholesale, Target, retail. Okay, this is great. So Jess also said Target fun. I like that. So there's no correct answer here, but I wanted to show you something really important, that for well-known brands, you typically can associate one very, very clear adjective to them. And I would say Costco, at least for me, when I was going through this exercise, that was much easier to do. It was much easier for me to be like, oh, they're cheap. In fact, the word cost is in Costco's name, right? And for something like Target, that in my opinion is good at some things, not great at any single thing, it's a lot harder. So perhaps Jess finds them fun, and maybe that's very clear to her, and I think that's wonderful. That means Target's doing a better job for Jess than they are for me. But why am I telling you this? Well, a lot of the principles in doing content right apply not just to writing, but to differentiating in whatever domain you're trying to compete in. And because of that, you can actually kind of apply examples from other domains as well. So you can apply examples from corporations or from startups, for example. And again, Costco is this great case study where, again, you would think, how does this relate to content? Well, Costco is a company that participated in a very competitive space, right? That aligns with what kind of the world of content that we're participating in today. And over the last several decades, they've just completely crushed it. And they didn't do it, you know, by making up a new industry or trying to, again, venture into these niches that no one cares about. They went into this very competitive space head on. But what they did is they said, we're going to have one differentiator. We're going to have one thing that we do differently, and it's going to kind of be embedded in everything we do, right? Everything we're trading off to be the absolute best in this one area, which is cost, which is why for all of us, it's so easy for us to say, okay, you know, Costco is cost, Costco is cheap, Costco is value, right? It was very easy for many people to come up with that. And you can imagine that for a general retail store, you have many different kind of angles or many different things, attributes that people might care about. And you have 6 here that I've added. And what I think Target, not trying to pick on Target, is more of is this right-hand side, where they're kind of like, they're not super low cost and they have, you know, a decent amount of brand diversity, and locations are kind of easy to get to, but also not that easy to get to. They're pretty good at everything. What Costco is they're pretty bad at many things, right? You go to, it's kind of a factory and they don't have much brand diversity because their SKUs are so big, or sorry, their package sizes are so big, so they don't have many SKUs. Because their factories are so big or their stores are so big, there's not many close locations. The ambiance isn't good. Like, you can kind of go down the list and be like, yeah, actually, yeah, Costco is pretty crappy at a lot of things, but they're amazing at one thing, right? Which is cost, which is why I don't know the exact stat, but it's something like 1/3 of Americans have a Costco membership, right? So they're doing something right. And you can use this learning with content. And so that leads me to the first thing in this set of exercises, which is all about differentiation. And this is so important whether you have a content property today or you're just starting one, because if you're going to participate in this very competitive space, you need to differentiate. And this is actually, from my perspective, I have people coming to me all the time saying, hey, Steph, I'm starting a blog or a podcast or whatever, or I already have, can you give me advice? And I look at them and I find out what they're doing. And the most common thing that they get wrong is they have absolutely no differentiator. So what do I mean by a differentiator? It means being better at something. Now, this sounds very vague, but it means tackling content in a way that is different in your approach. And this sounds very vague, but for example, I'll have people come to me and they'll say, hey, Steph, I'm starting a newsletter about tech. Like, do you think it'll be successful? And I'm like, I have zero clue if it'll be successful, because it could actually be the most successful newsletter about tech, or it could be the least. But I don't know how you're differentiating your content. Is it going to be funnier? Is it going to be more concise? Is it going to be more relatable? Is it going to be more punchy, more raw, more visual? Like, what is it going to be for me, for some cohort of users that care about that thing? And why is this important? It's important because this is the equivalent of the branding exercise that we just did with Costco, or how people talk about companies or content overall. You never hear someone say, hey, you should really read this newsletter. It's about travel. someone would be like, okay, like what about travel? But, you know, even if they travel, that's not how you communicate why something is great. You communicate why something is great because you're like, dude, this newsletter is so funny. Or, man, I've never seen someone like be this raw on a podcast. Or I have never seen someone go to this depth of analysis, right? Like you're communicating what they're doing with the content and how it's differentiated from all of the other content that exists in the sea. So these are a bunch of different examples of ways that content can be tackled differently. And that leads us into this exercise, which basically, if you can do this in a couple different ways. I have a notebook, so if you have paper next to you, feel free to use this. If you have your laptop open, feel free to pull up, you know, your Evernote, your Apple Notes, whatever you use. And this is going to be the first exercise, and we're going to spend around 3 minutes on it. I know it's not long, but I'm trying to fit in as much as we can in this hour. But basically, what I encourage you to do, and we probably can't finish all 8 in this 3 minutes, but is to write down your favorite 4 newsletters. Now, if you're creating a podcast or you're creating some other form of media, do that instead, right? So whatever kind of media you're trying to recreate on your own, feel free to adjust it and put it in place of newsletters. But write down your favorite 4 newsletters, for example, and in the left-hand side, so write that name down. In the middle, write down a short sentence. Doesn't even need to be 1 sentence, it could be 2, but of how you describe it, right? If you're telling a friend about this newsletter, about this podcast, how would you describe it? And again, I have a feeling, I may be wrong, but I have a feeling it's not going to be like, this is a newsletter about technology. It's going to be like, I am excited to open this every morning because it makes me smile, or something about how that newsletter, I guess, provides value for you. So once you've done that, parse that sentence as best as you can into a single adjective. So for example, it makes me smile is basically, you know, I find it funny or joyful. I feel updated, right? Drops in my inbox first thing in the morning. I find it informative. These are just examples. The reason that this is really important is because most of the time when I ask people if they have a differentiator, often it doesn't exist, or if it does, it's very, very vague, right? It's not clear. And if you can actually get to one single adjective where you can say, I am the funniest newsletter about travel in the world, that's a pretty clear differentiator. And if you can articulate that, it's a lot easier for your reader to understand why the hell you're differentiated and how they can tell other people about it. And then the final part of this exercise, if you have time in your 3 minutes, is to do the opposite. So when in the first 4, you go through things that you love. The second 4, go through things that you either have always disliked, or what I find even better is if you used to subscribe to a newsletter, for example, and you've now unsubscribed to it. Why is that? So you write down a sentence. Oh, it was way too long, right? Or it started getting really political and I didn't appreciate that they, you know, said X, Y, or Z. And then again, you do the same exercise. Well, it's too long, it's political, it's X, Y, or Z, right? It's not informative. And trying to nail down the types of things that you are drawn to and that you are not drawn to, right? And that'll help you come up with something on your own. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set a timer for 3 minutes. I'm going to stop talking, and I want you on your laptop or on your piece of paper to go through this exercise as much as possible. And if we don't have time for the full exercise, just, you know, bookmark it and you can come back to it after the session. Okay, I know that went by quickly, but that was 3 minutes. And so again, I have a feeling that you weren't able to fully complete the exercise. So bookmark this and definitely take some time to go through these exercises plus the ones that I don't include in the session after the session at some other point. But as we move on, I'd love to know in the chat if you did get to them and get to the adjective, what were some of your favorite newsletters, or again, it could be podcasts, blogs, movies, all forms of content, and what were their adjectives. While I wait to see if anyone adds theirs, some of mine, for example, are I love Charter, and Charter is a newsletter that is it's a tech and business newsletter, which again, very competitive space, but they do visuals. And I would say visuals, you could either say are more visual, or you could also say they're more concise. The reason that I love Charter is that I don't have to read this long novel about a particular topic. As they say, a picture's worth 1,000 words. And for me, that is actually what Charter provides for me. It's concise. And again, you could say more visual, but I think a lot of people also say that, for example, about James Clear's 321 newsletter. It's just the most concise newsletter. And if you notice, the newsletters that do this well, James Clear actually has a line at the top of his newsletter that almost trains people to realize that concise nature of his newsletter, in that I think it says it's like the most, I think it's the most value for the least words on the internet or something like that. I'm totally butchering it, but the point is that you can actually train people to notice this as well, or associate it the same way that Costco has cost in its name. So I see a couple examples that I'll just call out. Lenny's, for example, Lenny's does a PM or product management newsletter. Julio thinks it's the most actionable. Love Mondays. I see Learn, most helpful. Some of them from Corey, in general, raw, no bullshit, charismatic, authentic, insightful. Eric Tornberg's is most analytical, according to Nicole. Piyush says Fab Fridays are rational. Marie Poulin is value or resonance. So I think what I see here that I want to just quickly call out is that the value that you look for is going to differ, and that's normal, right? That's the same way that some people are drawn to really premium products like physical products, and other people are drawn to more eco-friendly products, and other people are drawn to other kinds of products, right, that resonate with them. And so what's important here is that, again, when people try to create content, they often think like, let me make this really approachable to everyone. And that may have been important in the mass media days, but today you have the potential to reach anyone, anywhere. And so you no longer need to appeal to everyone. In fact, you shouldn't appeal to everyone. That's the Target example that I gave. You want to be a Costco. You want to find your one angle that some cohort of people really care about, right? Not that everyone cares about, but that some people care about. So someone out there is writing this really raw, no bullshit newsletter that Corey loves. And maybe someone else doesn't love that, but that's okay. They don't need to subscribe. The Coreys of the world will subscribe and love it, instead of, again, being kind of something for everyone. All right, so that brings me to your personal monopoly exercise 2, which is this idea where, again, some people may have already created their content, but this is an exercise that everyone should return to determine if you are writing about the things that enable you to have a differentiator. So as you try to search for your differentiator, it can be hard sometimes because you're like, well, I have a ton of things I want to write about, and I have a ton of angles I want to take with that content. And the advice I'd like to give is that as you're thinking about what you might want to write about, the easiest way to have a differentiator is to talk about something you know really damn well, right? You don't need to be the Olympic athlete, meaning you don't need to be the absolute most knowledgeable person about this. But if you have spent an above average time learning something, that information, that knowledge can be translated into information that's going to be valuable to the average person. And you can imagine this kind of curve or this spectrum where on the left-hand side, imagine that this is someone who knows absolutely nothing about a particular topic. And then on the right-hand side, that's the equivalent of an Olympic athlete who knows the most about a topic. Well, anywhere that you are along the spectrum, anyone to the left of you can learn from you, right? And so you don't need to be the absolute most knowledgeable, but the further to the right you are, the more people that can benefit from your knowledge and the work that you've done in your life. So as you're thinking through what you want to write about, I'm not going to focus too much on this slide, but you want to think about kind of the intersection of what people find interesting. Again, there has to be demand there. what you can uniquely contribute to, right? So something you know quite well, and then something that doesn't exist in its exact form. And this number two part is your differentiator, right? So how are you actually tackling this differently than what already exists? And my example of when I first did this was I was writing about remote work, but I was doing it in, I think, a way that people weren't writing about it. It wasn't to get a bunch of page views to convert people on a product. It was mostly to just talk about in a raw form what I actually thought remote work was before, of course, the whole world got opened up to it. But the key here is that because we're, again, not in that mass media age or era, you can write about anything. And I think if you're on this call and you're ambitious and you go and you learn things throughout your life, there are going to be things that you know a lot more about than most people. So there are newsletters about Google Sheets, medicinal marijuana deals in Arizona. One of my favorites is this newsletter about unnecessary inventions, where this guy just found is just super creative and knows a 3D printer really well, as in knows how to use one really well, and just comes up with these really hilarious unnecessary inventions. And he's just spent way more time thinking about that than the average person. And so he's just so good at it. And there's this thing at the bottom of this slide that I think is really important, because for you to be successful with your content, you need a differentiator. Now, in order for you to have a differentiator, it's a lot easier for you to do that if you know something quite well. And I typically give the example where I actually, unfortunately, only know one language, but for people who know multiple languages, I've heard that you feel like you really know a language when you can start using humor with it, right? And you can kind of, again, flip that on its head where, okay, I can now tell jokes with this because I understand this really well. And you can kind of parallel that to what I'm saying here with content, which is if you know a topic really well, that's when you can start to get real funny with it, or real raw with it, or real, X, Y, or Z differentiator with it. So that's why it's important to really think through what you've spent more time than the average person thinking about. You can actually kind of say those are in some way your obsessions, right? Things that, again, you spend more time with than the average person. And so this is exercise 2A. There's two parts of this, but basically, again, I encourage you to do this even if you have something that you write about already, to just think through, like, what else could I write about? Or is this the best thing for me to write about? But to go through these questions that I'll quickly read out loud and then write down what I'm calling 5 zones of excellence. This doesn't mean that, again, you would be the top 1% if there was a test about this, but what's something that you think about in the shower, for example? That's one of the questions down here. What is something that you've done that 95% of the population hasn't done? Or a unique insight that you think 99% of the population doesn't have? What is something that you've spent 5 years or more doing that you could translate to someone in significantly less time? What is something that you would have loved to have existed 5 years ago before you went and invested all that time? So these are just some prompts for you to start thinking through, like, what are the things that I truly know quite well, or that I think about a lot for whatever reason that I just love, and most people, don't love thinking about, but I do. And so take a couple minutes, I'll set a timer again, and just start thinking through what your 5 zones of excellence are, and then we'll do a follow-up exercise on that in a minute. So I'm going to start the timer, and I'll see you in 3 minutes. All right, we are back, and I'm gonna, I can't remember if yes, I have a question here, which feel free to share in the chat what your zones of excellence were, if you came up with any. And as you share in the chat, I did wanna just answer a question from Phoenix, and it was that basically, what if you have 3 areas that are so diverse? So the example is math, spirituality, productivity hacks. What if I don't feel like there's an intersection between my zones of excellence? My answer there is that you have a couple different options. If you're optimizing purely for as quick growth around your content as possible, you can really benefit at the beginning from specializing. This is in the same way, actually, there's a slide later on that I'll show where basically even huge companies that we're familiar with today, like Facebook, started a lot more siloed, a lot more niche, because it's a lot easier to tackle a particular group of users with a particular problem at the beginning and then branch out from there. And so if you're unsure and you do have a bunch of different areas of interest, you can benefit from choosing one, even though you're brainstorming a bunch, from choosing one to start with. Now I say start with because you definitely can benefit, especially if you want to write about all these things, from branching out in the future about those things. I will also say that this will tie directly into the distribution section that we'll talk about next week, because it also matters where you are getting your traffic from. So if you, for example, are mostly focused on getting your traffic from SEO, well, it doesn't actually matter if you're writing about even 30 different things on your blog, because someone is finding you through a search query that's relevant to them. However, if your main distribution channel is something like your own Twitter, that's when it can get a little confusing for people, because they're like, oh, I thought this person talked about math and now they're writing about psychology and now they're writing about something else. And so how you're actually getting your traffic impacts how you might make that decision. I will say, though, that it also depends on, my answer originally was, if you're trying to grow quickly, if that doesn't matter as much to you, which is the case for me, if you go to my blog, I write about remote work, but I also talk about women in tech and psychology and time management and content. And so it's all over the place. And I would say that my approach there wasn't the most optimal in terms of growing quickly, but I was okay with that because I was more focused on writing about the things that I wanted to. And again, a lot of my traffic comes through SEO as well. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of an idea. And thank you to everyone who's been sharing in the chat. I see Corey mentioned psychology, specifically how to clarify what matters most in your life and design your business around it. Jess mentioned mental fitness and toughness. Bhavani says how to learn better, mostly how tech is evolving, or Piyush said something that doesn't exist, a list guide of the numerous career paths that exist out there. I think that's a great idea. David said technology and society, human-robot interaction, computer history, software, marginalia. I don't know if I know what that means, but that's great, right? Like, I may not be the reader for your newsletter, but again, you're not trying to appeal to everyone. Olga says sales hiring. So it's great that you're thinking about this. And I would just say with this question, carry this question with you as you go through your interactions or as you're in the shower. Just start noticing what you think a lot about. That sounds very simple. And the other proxy that I'd say to carry around with you is pay attention to what people ask you for. So if people are constantly coming to you, for example, for help with negotiation, that is a sign that you know a lot about that thing, but it also has another modifier that means that someone is looking for that. There's demand for that idea as well, or that information. That brings us to exercise B, which is part of this. You already wrote down your 5 zones of excellence. Now, having a particular topic is not enough. Remember, no one talks about a newsletter and says, I'm so glad this newsletter writes about travel, because there's so many that do. It's how they write about it. So next to each of your zones of excellence, if you've written them down, so for example, I have remote work and I have accuracy, but I think I was just a little more raw with how I wrote about it. I want you to think through what your edge is, your edge applied to your zone of excellence. Hopefully that makes sense. But again, here are some reminders of the examples. You could be more humorous, more contrarian, more relatable, more deeply researched. The only thing that I ask of you is that you don't write better, because better is way too vague, right? Your newsletter might be better, but if it is better in some particular way. And you can also go through some of these additional questions to get an idea of how you might get to that better, right? So are there certain things that you see your competitors doing or actually rather not doing, like if McKinsey would never publish this because it would be too raw for them, right? Or I see these long reports from Gartner and I think I could actually deliver that information in a quarter of the time. So you can kind of go through these prompts to think through what your edge might be. And again, I'm going to give you a couple minutes here. I'm going to set the timer now. I know we're running out of time, so I might even just do 2 minutes. But take some time right now to think through, if you wrote down your 5 zones of excellence or even 1, what your edge might be, what your differentiator might be for that zone of excellence. All right, I'm gonna keep us moving here just because, again, we don't have too much more time, but hopefully you've thought through or started thinking through what your edge might be. And again, I would, similar to 2A, encourage you to bring this question with you and start noticing, when you talk about a certain subject, do you love just like going super deep on it? Do you love being humorous about it? Do you love being really raw with your story? Think through those things, because you're gonna notice, if you're paying attention, how you naturally interact with these ideas. And it can be important, or it can be useful rather, to kind of ruminate over these ideas instead of just jumping at the first thing that comes to mind. I do see a question from MC saying, previously you mentioned that specialization matters more with socials as a distribution channel, but blogs could have lots of variety. What about newsletters on that spectrum stuff? More like blogs. Well, I would actually say newsletters are interesting because newsletters are like blogs, like podcasts. They're forms of content, forms of media. And so newsletters utilize distribution channels. Like a newsletter is not a distribution channel. I guess you could say it is, but it's more of an owned one. And so you'd want to think through, how am I getting traffic to this newsletter? Typically, because newsletters, well, I guess I'll say typically newsletters take one of those forms. They either like are on a website attached to a blog, in which case that blog gets a lot of organic traffic, which is actually what I recommend, and you'll see that in the distribution section. Or what a lot of people do as well is, of course, they're linked to their social channels and they're building up a Twitter following, for example. And so the newsletter itself is typically linked to another distribution channel. And then I would consider what that distribution channel is best at, if it needs to be differentiated or not. And again, you can always have a wide range of topics. It just may not be as suited early on for your success, right? But again, if you have patience and you just want to talk about these topics, there's nothing wrong with that. It's just that you can kind of accelerate your growth more quickly if you're more niche down and you're more specific, and people can start associating you with that thing. And that's why, even though I don't love it, you'll see a ton of people who write marketing guy, sales guy, writing guy, or girl, of course, on their newsletter, or sorry, on their Twitter, because they want people to build that association. All right, the third thing, and I'm gonna breeze through this, but this actually relates to exactly what I was saying about niching down. So your niche is your specialty. Now, what's important here is niche does not mean that it's some small topic. It can, right? Because we're in this era where you don't need to do mass media, but it's your niche value or your niche positioning, what you're providing to people, which can be really broad. It doesn't have to be niche in the sense that, again, it's only a topic that only 10 people care about. So specific does not equal small. And what's important here is related to what I said before. We're in this really competitive market, but with content in particular, people are not monogamous with their content. So even if you went through the prior exercise and you thought, man, like, I really want to be like the funniest travel newsletter out there, but I already know this funny travel newsletter. Well, people are not monogamous with their content, meaning that some people read 3 newsletters every morning about what's happening in business and tech. I do that, right? So you don't need to be afraid if you see people already doing something that you want to do. And this relates to what I mentioned before, where if you start out niche in terms of really focusing on one thing, you can always expand. But focusing on one thing allows you to focus, to really nail down what you're providing for one group of people. And these are a bunch of examples of companies or content platforms that started a lot more niche that are now huge, right? And you can see what they started out as at the bottom, and then of course what we recognize them to be today. So one of the things that we'll do in this next exercise very, very quickly is, if you really have thought through your differentiator, right, and your zone of excellence, tied to that, you should know exactly who you're targeting with those two things. And if you have really parsed this in a clear way, you should be able to say, similar to startups who have their one-liner, you should have your content one-liner, which I like to say is your what for who. And these are a couple examples of content platforms or content newsletters or blogs that have done this already. So Numlock is one that I love, which they say is Good Morning America for nerdier folks. Farnham Street says they're noise canceling headphones for the internet. Rad Reed says Oprah for millennials, and you can keep going down. And so again, we're running out of time, but we'll give you a minute or two here to just sit down and think through, or start to think through, because you may not get to something by the end, which is, if you are writing about something or you hope to write about something, what is your what for who? What is your single sentence that captures exactly what you're doing in a really crisp way that tackles who it's for, what it is, and then also you'll notice embedded in each of these is the differentiator, right? You get a sense of how they're doing what they're writing about differently. So I'll give you 2 minutes now, and then we'll come back. All right, so we're gonna keep moving. Hopefully you'll have some more time to think about this what for who, but this is really important. And this is, again, the same exercise that many startups go through. If you don't have a clear what for who, you're probably venturing a little blind and not really narrowing in, not being clear about what value you're providing. All right, we're not probably gonna have time for this, all of these exercises, so I may just share them with you. But basically this next one is figuring out your addressable market. And this is basically the equivalent of doing competitor research that, again, you would do for a startup, but you also can do for your content. So you get a sense of what's out there, what you love, what you can do differently. And here are a bunch of tools where, again, I'll send out these slides later that I encourage you to go browse through. So subreddit stats allows you to go look up a particular subreddit. So let's say you want to write about sleep. There's a sleep subreddit out there that you can go look at. And on subreddit stats, you can see exactly what the top posts have been of all time, per month, etc. And therefore you can get a sense of what people are looking for. Anvaka is another tool where you can actually input a subreddit and you can see all of the related subreddits so that you can get a sense of the whole landscape there. And maybe there's a particular niche topic that you really want to talk about, and so it can get those juices flowing. SimilarWeb allows you to see if you have a competitor, how much traffic they're getting. Ahrefs allows you to do something similar with specific keywords, or to look up how much volume a particular keyword has. Ghostery is a cool tool where you can, it's basically a plugin that allows you to see what your competitors are using on their site, what pixels are running. That gives you a sense of what they're doing with their site, right? So if they have a Snapchat pixel, they're likely advertising on Snapchat. Moat is a cool tool where you can see what display ads any site is running, similar to Facebook ad library, which is the equivalent for Facebook. And then you can also just like look up what communities exist, whether it's on Telegram or Slack or Facebook or Discord for your target personas. And then I'd encourage you to go join those and also get a sense of how many people are active there. And again, if you see a lot of people active in a particular place, that's a good sign, not a bad sign. It should not scare you away. So I'd encourage you to spend some time to go through some of these tools and look at what you might consider your competitors to be. So we're not going to have as much time to go through this. I'm going to skip by this, and I encourage you to spend some time on this after. And then audience, or exercise 5, sorry, I'm stumbling over my words, is audience personas, where again, I'm going to leave this one with you. But if you've gone through the what for who, that who may be millennials. It may be something very, very short and sweet. But now what I want you to do is I want you to open that back up. I want you to think through your 100 true fans. You've probably heard of this, 100 true fans, 1,000 true fans. Your true fan is basically someone that benefits from your solution a disproportionate amount. So most people can probably benefit from what you're creating. But who can benefit from this? 100x what the average person can benefit from. And so when you think through who that person is, I want you to really think through who that person is. And what I mean by that is I don't want you to say, I'm targeting millennials at this point. I want you to say exactly what their demographics are. What do they read? What are the problems that they face daily? What do they complain to their spouse about every single day? And what are those problems that you can help solve them? And so basically, what I want you to do is come up with something like this paragraph down at the bottom, which is the writer of HBCU Digest created this. And so credit to him who created this, but basically they wrote down exactly who they were targeting, right? And so I want you to model something like this off of your own audience or your own blog, newsletter, etc. I just breezed through exercises 4 and 5, but there's also exercises 6 to 10, which address chapters 1 and 2, and additional exercises in there that I encourage you to go through. Now, we won't have time for that one, but let me just go through. I'm trying to see for time. I'm kind of stumbling because I'm like, how much more can we go through here? But basically, what I'm going to breeze through super, super quickly is so far that what I've gone through was chapter 1. Now, chapter 2, I want to make like 2 quick comments, which is chapter 2 is about building your home. And in building your home, the most common thing I see people do, you could say wrong, or they're led astray, is they worry too much about their stack. And so the key thing that I'm going to skip the chat question that I want you to take away here is that there are infinite tools, and there's more tools every day to build your digital home. What I want you to take away is that you just need something good enough. So if you haven't built your digital home and you're considering this, I want you to take away that these are the stacks of some of the most popular apps or sites that you're aware of, Facebook, Spotify, and Medium, and you have no idea what is under the hood for them. And the same thing applies to your blog or your website. As long as you have something good enough that works, do not obsess over finding the perfect solution, because most things you can change in the future as well. And also, don't try to make it perfect, because there's a saying that basically says like perfect is the enemy of progress. And this is true, where if you are the person who obsesses over having the absolute perfect design or the absolute perfect website before you launch your blog or your newsletter or your podcast, it'll never ship. And these are great examples of the first versions of, again, very popular, very big sites that we're all familiar with today that look very different to what they first looked like. And then the final takeaway that I want you to take from chapter 2, which I want you to dig into, is this idea of paid or free. So we are in a place where basically people expect free content these days. That narrative is shifting a little bit, but for the most part, we expect content to be free because of the supply and demand dynamics there, because there's so much supply out there, right? And for that reason, you do want to consider if you want to go paid or free, because that is a marker, that is a decision, and that is going to determine the scale of your publication most likely. I will say that there are many paid publications that have emerged over the years. Trends is one of them. I, of course, work for Trends. And if you are going to go paid, you need to differentiate even more significantly. And if people have probably heard of this term, vitamin or a painkiller, you need to be a painkiller. And here are some ways that you can be a painkiller, or that people are more willing to pay for painkillers. You can see they're more actionable. They're specifically able to win back their time. Sometimes it's to fund a specific type of journalism, or to be part of an organization or feel part of a whole. The key thing I want you to take away from paid or free is that a lot of people, especially with the Substacks of the world kind of coming online in recent years, romanticize having a paid content platform, because of course it's nice that you can make money immediately. But what's important here is that if you are creating a paid newsletter, you are losing your distribution vectors. And that may be okay for you, and maybe you're okay of taking a more kind of bootstrapped approach and growing slowly, and you don't need to reach tons of people. And maybe this is super obvious, but the key here is that if you really want to grow a large audience, do not go paid immediately. You can at some other point add paid tiers, add paid features in the back end, add courses. That's what I did. I have all of my online content free, and then I have courses like doing content right. But just keep that in mind, that the ceiling is lower with paid content. And this is probably hard to see, but basically, if you go to, I believe Substack took it down, but they used to have a page that showed all of their top newsletters. And if you go down the list, most of them had, they had some sort of distribution engine outside of that. The same thing is true of Trends, right? We had the Hustle Daily newsletter, which is 1.5 million people. The same thing is true where Pomp was one of the top ones. He had a massive Twitter following before he had a paid newsletter. Matt Taibbi, he was a well-known journalist before that. And so know the game you're getting into. And if you don't already have distribution vectors, do not launch a paid newsletter first, or I shouldn't say never do it, but that is generally I think where you can falter. And so just quickly, if you do want to at some point monetize your content, you can do it in a different way where you're not launching paid, but you instead are building up a large audience, nurturing that audience over time. And then you can either set a date for conversion based on your goals to a paid newsletter, or you can have some free version, some paid version. That's kind of like Trends in the Hustle. But just keep this in mind. And again, there's a lot more information about this in Doing Content Right. So I'm going to leave it there and leave you with some homework. And again, so sorry for rushing through this and not getting through everything. But basically for the exercises 4 to 10 that we didn't have a chance to get through, and the ones that we did, take some time and go through them. I promise that if you go through those exercises, I hope that you will have a much clearer view of what you're trying to do within the content space, instead of just diving right in, where again, most people just jump right in and they're like, I'm creating a newsletter. And I'm like, great. And then 6 months later, they had no more clarity than when they started about what they're actually trying to do in that space. So don't be that person. Start with knowing exactly what you're trying to tackle, exactly what you're best at, and exactly how you're going to differentiate from what already is out there. Before next week's session, if you have time, this is optional, the same way it was optional for this section, is to read through chapters 3 and 4, because that's what we'll tackle next time. And then if you have any extra questions, because we don't have time for them right now, you can either email me, you can post them in the Doing Content Right community chat, and I'll be there to answer them. Or there is a bonus AMA where all we're doing during that session is me answering questions. And you can do that asynchronously as well. So if you go to lou.ma/bonus-ama-3, if you go there, and it was also in the email I sent out, you can either sign up so you can join me live and I'll answer your question, or there is a document where you can add your question and then I will answer them during that session, and I will send out itemized a list of time-stamped answers. So you, if you want, can only listen to your particular question's answer. All right, so that is your homework for this week. I hope you guys found this useful. Yep, this is the appendix, so that's it. All right, so that was it for this session. If you stuck with me 7 minutes past, thank you. I hope this was useful. I hope you find Doing Content Right useful. And again, always there to answer any questions if you have them, so feel free to reach out to me. And I hope that I see you all next week. Thank you so much for joining. All right, bye everyone.